a firefighter sweeps in there, puts out the fire, gets credit for saving the day. But it's much better if the fire never happens. It might not be as glamorous, you might not get as much credit for it, but you're going to be a lot more successful if you can orient your company, orient your group, your division towards trying to prevent fires from happening. Think about what the structural issues are where things could go wrong. What is the big picture challenge that you face that, yeah, you might be able to keep on putting a Band-Aid on the problem, but you're better off looking broadly, asking those tangential questions that might seem unrelated, might be annoying to the people who are just pushing and rushing and driving towards a quick solution, but ultimately you're better off getting the biggest picture perspective on what someone's challenge is so you can solve the problem.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leading the Future of Work. My guest today, Julia Boorstin, CNBC, Senior Media and Tech Correspondent and author of a brand new book coming out October 11th, 2022, and it is called When Women Lead, What We Achieve, Why We Succeed, and What We Can Learn. Julia, thank you for joining me.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Of course. Why don't we start with a little bit of background information about you? So take us way back to baby Julia. Did you always know you wanted to be in media? Did you always know that you wanted to take this path?
I didn't. I thought maybe I'd want to be a lawyer, work in international relations. I was really interested in politics and the world of international relations, but I did always love to ask questions. And I found myself, I have in my family, a lot of writers and journalists, and I found myself working on the newspaper in high school. And then I went on to work in the newspaper in college. And even as I did internships in many other fields, I really loved to write and to ask questions. And I found myself sort of drawn to that journalism community and did take a bunch of great writing classes in college. And so when I graduated college, I thought that I was going to take the LSAT. I thought I was going to go off to grad school to study international relations, but I figured, a bunch of my friends are moving to New York and there's this opportunity to go apply to work at a magazine. This was 2000. And at the time, the magazine industry was really exciting and robust. And it felt like there was this energy and nexus of power in the journalism industry in New York. So I applied to a bunch of magazine jobs, and it just happened, because I had no particular interest in business news at the time, it just happened that the best opportunity was a reporter job at Fortune magazine. So I figured, I'll try this out for a year. I didn't think business journalism would be that exciting. I thought I'd much prefer to work at a place like Time magazine or Entertainment Weekly, but it turned out that I just had the luckiest break of all time to be hired at Fortune magazine. I was actually hired right before the dot-com bubble burst, and I started my job a couple months later after it burst. I was the last person they hired before then. And it was just the luckiest opportunity to land at Fortune magazine at that time. I had so many phenomenal mentors, and I got to watch this transformation of the American economy from this storytelling perspective. And through that window, got this amazing education in business. There were a lot of people there who mentored me and taught me everything I needed to know about the business world, whether it was how to read SEC documents or how to dig into companies' annual reports. And then I was at Fortune for 6 years. During that time, I started appearing as a contributor on CNN and CNN Headline News. And then from there, I was hired to CNBC, and I have been there at CNBC since 2006, a very long time.
It's funny, it's a very similar path that my wife took. She was also in LA. We both went to the University of California, Santa Cruz, but we didn't know each other. And she worked for the school newspaper there. Then she moved to New York. She interned for a couple of publications there. It didn't work out the way she wanted, and then she ended up working for a conference company. But she very much had that journalism background as well. And now she writes books too, speaks at conferences, but focused a lot on.
Awesome. Yeah, and I was in New York. I went straight from went to Princeton. I was in New Jersey. I went straight to New York City, and I had my 6 years at Fortune magazine in New York, and then my first year or so at CNBC was in New York. And then they offered me the option of what I would rather cover. The choice was, would you rather cover media, which included all of these things that were in the sort of the beginning of so much change from Los Angeles, or cover retail from New York? And retail is a massive business, but I just saw so much opportunity to report on transformation and disruption covering media, which quickly became the addition of social media. And then from that, I moved into technology as well. So I was very lucky to get that choice, and then to move back out to LA and dig into these crazy technological transformations in the California-based companies in particular.
Yeah, I'm also in LA. We used to live in the Bay Area, and we recently relocated back to LA, I think 7 months ago. So probably not too far away from where you are.
Yeah.
So why did you even write this book, which is coming out October of this year? What was the impetus and the driving force for putting it out there?
So the background for When Women Lead is, I love reading books. I listen to a lot of books on audio. I'm always reading a book. And I love storytelling about real people that can change the way you think about how you live your life. And this book came about really because of two projects that I work on at CNBC. The first is called the Disruptor 50 List. And about 10 years ago, CNBC is all about big public companies, but I was really attracted to and curious about the innovation happening at startups. So about 10 years ago, I said, we need to do more on startups and to talk about startups through the lens of investing. And so I created this list to highlight the 50 fastest growing private venture-backed companies, with the idea that these are the companies that are disrupting the way business works, changing our lives, and they're either going to become the next publicly traded behemoths, or they're forcing those giants to change their behavior. So I was working on this list. I was interviewing phenomenal CEOs, learning so much about innovation, leadership, and what it takes to create a game-changing business. I was also struck by the fact that women were in the vast minority, tiny minority of leaders of those companies, but I was really impressed by those women. And I noticed them tackling challenges and talking about problems a little differently. At the same time, I was working on my other pet project at CNBC, another passion project of mine called Closing the Gap. And this was a franchise that I helped co-create to talk about people and companies that are closing gender and diversity gaps. And what I found in that project is that there's massive untapped opportunity, financial opportunity, in having more diversity and not having such massive gaps in representation, in leadership, but also across different employee ranks. So as I was looking through that closing the gap data, I kept on coming across these statistics showing how little access female leaders get to financing. So the number that was top of mind is the fact that women get 3% or less, female founders get 3% or less of all venture capital financing.
Wow, that's crazy.
And this is true for the past 10 years, 3%. So this is not just a 1 year blip or 1 year, a weird thing happened. This is on average for the past 3 years, women have never gotten more than 3% of venture capital dollars. You know how much venture capital has transformed the way we live. Think about companies like Uber or Airbnb or Facebook or Google. All those companies could succeed because they had venture capital backing. So I was looking at these women who had managed to defy those odds, who were CEOs of companies on the Disruptor 50 list. I thought, gosh, these women are by definition exceptional. They are exceptions to the rule. And I wanted to tell their stories. And in starting to tell their stories, I realized there were things about their leadership characteristics that had enabled them to defy their odds, that had enabled them to be exceptional, that we could all learn from. So I started with the stories and the interviews, interviewed about 150 people. And from there, I started digging into the academic research, the data about leadership, the data about what different skill sets and approaches are most effective in the workplace. And that's how I reported out this book. So the book is an intersection of about 65 stories of women with about 100 academic studies explaining what they're doing in those stories, why they work, and why they'd be valuable lessons for us all to embrace.
So why do you think that's the case as far as 97% of capital or 3% only going to women? And have you looked at, for example, why we don't have more female CEOs? I think, what is it, like 2 or 3% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women.
It's
Something
slightly
on,
higher than that. It's about, I think it's
or maybe
around
8%.
8%. It's around 8%. That is an all-time high. So
Yeah.
8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women, which is an all-time high. And every once in a while, like one or two will leave or be
Yeah.
added and like move that percentage. I think it all comes down to something that, and I think it's important to say that I don't think it's malicious.
Yeah.
I don't think at this point in time, women are being excluded from fundraising or being excluded from Fortune 500 CEO roles, which by the way, it's a very complex calculation of how you get to that point. Because of anything malicious, I think it's because of a lot of social and structural issues, but specifically this one idea of pattern matching. And this is particularly relevant when it comes to the venture funding. Pattern matching is the idea that if you're looking to invest in a founder, you want to invest in someone who fits into a pattern that's worked before.
Yeah.
So much venture investment happens at the early stage before companies have a track record, before there's revenue to show, even before you might have an idea of a business plan, but it would be long before profitability. So investors have to invest in someone who reminds them or matches a pattern of someone else who's been successful in the past. So I have some quotes from VCs in the book, that were things that were publicly reported in the New York Times of VCs saying, I invested in a guy because he reminded me of Mark Zuckerberg. That's why they made a decision. And so that's a natural instinct. To invest in someone who reminds you of some other guy who was successful, and that's most likely going to be a white male like Mark Zuckerberg, but also someone who these VCs want to hang out with, someone who reminds them of themselves. And there is a lot of data about how VCs are largely male and white. Something like 85% of all VC funds, as of the most recent study, did not have a single female investing partner.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. So yes, men can invest in women, and they do on occasion, but the data shows that women are twice as likely to invest, female VCs are twice as likely to invest in a female founder than a male VC is. So if you want to have more diversity in who's raising money, you're going to need to have more diversity in who's making the investments. And again, these are, the venture capital industry has not changed dramatically. It's a small groups of people who are making a couple of big bets a year, and they want to make sure that they're building a portfolio of people they want to spend time with, and also that seem to fit into patterns. So I think it's really important to highlight this, because pattern matching and bias, unconscious bias, impacts all of us in different ways. And the more we can identify it, say, like, maybe you shouldn't be looking to hire someone who fits a pattern. Maybe just look at their skill sets. And actually, towards the end of the book, I dive into some tools that have been developed to address hiring. The investing is sort of at one end part of the funnel, and then at the other hand, you look at hiring, and there's a lot of data and research, and now these super high-tech hiring firms that are using data so you can hire people based on their potential and not based on their experience. So someone who's gone to an Ivy League school and was raised with wealth and privilege has a lot of advantages, but they may not have a better skill set to do a new thing than someone who did not have those same advantages. So now there's great technology to strip out that stuff and just look at someone's ability to do certain things and what their particular talents are now, not just their resume.
Do you think the same thing is true for CEO roles or leadership roles inside of organizations? It's still the pattern matching?
It's different. That's complicated, right? Because to rise to a CEO role, you have to go through many, many, many levels of promotions. So there have been a lot of studies about this idea of like a broken rung, where women are not getting promoted at the same rate as men are. And in fact, there have been great studies by companies such as Salesforce. Salesforce wanted to look at their pay gap. They said, we're going to close our pay gap. We're not going to have a pay gap. And what they discovered is they actually didn't technically have a pay gap, but they discovered a promotion gap. If men were asking for promotions more frequently, men were getting promoted more frequently, so they were actually getting paid more, even though the issue was not technically about people getting paid at certain levels. The question was how quickly people were going to get promoted. So what's inspiring and encouraging to me is that there is an ability to figure this stuff out. The fact that companies like Salesforce and PayPal have really been leaders in identifying, okay, what is the promotion gap? Why do we have a promotion gap? PayPal started doing this thing where they would just do reviews of people frequently and of their employees frequently at the same time to make sure they weren't unfairly promoting the squeaky wheel who might be more likely to be a man.
Interesting. And is it true just for leadership in general? Like if we don't look at the CEO role, we just look at like VPs, directors. Do you think the pattern role plays a part in there as well?
I mean, look, unconscious bias and pattern matching, and then also this question of the funnel. If there's a broken rung, as the McKinsey studies, their McKinsey and Lead-In did a study about how women were like missing this one promotion. Yeah. So if you miss too many promotions earlier in your career or in your late 20s, early 30s, then you're not going to be able to get to the CEO role. So there's so many factors at play. And the reason why I decided to focus in is particularly in my first chapter on the VC funding is it's such a specific thing that can have such a massive impact. Yeah. And the gaps are so massive. And you have to wonder, though, having only 8% of CEOs in the Fortune 500 be women, what kind of archetype does that share? You know, we all have these like archetypes in our head. What does a CEO look like? What does a policeman look like? I mean, there's so many different images that are sort of seared in our head as stereotypes. And I think it's really important to identify, like, just because the archetype of a startup CEO is Mark Zuckerberg doesn't mean that you have to look like Mark Zuckerberg to be a successful tech CEO.
I remember actually, I think it was Barbara Humpton. She's the CEO of Siemens in the United States. They have like 50,000 people. And she was telling me how early on in her career, a lot of people basically told her, like, you're not going to be able to be a mom and be a successful leader. You're going to have to pick one. And everyone was like, you should just quit. You're not going to be able to make it. If you have kids, it's going to kill your career. And so she was, as she was trying to climb that corporate ladder, that's kind of the message that she was being given by everyone. And of course, she ignored everybody and became the CEO of a 50,000 person company. So she's one of those inspiring female leaders that kind of took all that negativity and people going against her and just used it to just dominate, which I love.
Yeah, and I'm so fascinated by that. One question I would always ask these women I would interview is, how did you do it? And how did you not get discouraged? Yeah. I mean, not only were people probably telling you can't have a family and have a career, but people were telling you, like, how are you going to have a startup and get in that tiny percent of people who get VC funding, let alone the tiny percent of women who get VC funding. And so I would always ask, how did you not get discouraged? Because, I'm a risk averse person. I've had 2 jobs in my career. There's no question that I'm risk averse. And I actually, in one of the chapters later in the book, I really dig into this idea of how do you build resilience and figure out how not to let things discourage you? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that women in my book told me, and this is something that sort of came out in different ways, is this idea that if you could identify something as bias and say, okay, that comment that I got, someone telling me I'm not going to be able to do this because women never succeed in this role, if I can identify, say, actually, you know what, that is bias, then I could take it and set it aside and prevent it from permeating my psyche. So there's this woman, Aya Badir, who founded a startup called Little Bits, which was like a tech game startup for kids. And she's Lebanese and she's a woman and she had so much bias and people just said the most ridiculous things to her. But she said she thinks about it like wearing a jacket when it's cold out. When you know it's going to be cold out, you have to wear a jacket. And she says, like, protecting yourself is bias and being like, I know I'm going to face it. I'm just not going to let it bother me. Yeah. And it's just like a thing you do, like wearing your jacket when it's cold.
I had a couple of women that I interviewed, a couple of CEOs for the podcast, and I asked them similar questions. And they're like, we didn't view ourselves as, I know it sounds weird, but as female CEOs, we viewed ourselves as leaders, not being a female leader, but just being a leader and doing whatever we need to do to become a successful and a great leader. And I thought that was very interesting too, on how some people view themselves and think of themselves and talk to themselves internally. And I remember one CEO, I think it was Kathy Mazzarella, the CEO of Graybar. And she just told me that she kept doing things that made her uncomfortable and taking jobs that nobody else wanted. And then she became the CEO of, Fortune 500 company. So yeah, a lot of very, very inspiring stories from some really amazing leaders out there. And I get inspired by my wife all the time because she's pretty kick-ass. And she oftentimes does things I'm like, oh man, that would make me feel uncomfortable. And she's just like,
You got to do it. You have to
Yeah.
make yourself uncomfortable. And that's actually something that came up a lot, is this idea of, well, two things. One, in terms of making yourself uncomfortable, there's no way you're going to know if you could do something until you do it.
Yeah.
So thinking about it, wondering if you could do it is not going to get you there. You just have to do it. But in terms of what you said about the female CEOs, they don't think of themselves as CEOs. They're just CEOs.
Yeah.
The problem is they're being judged as a female CEO. Jen Hyman, who's CEO of Rent the Runway, she said that, it's hard because she felt like, especially at a particular point in her career when they were raising a lot of money, every interview, every question she was asked is like, what's it like to be a female CEO? What's it like to be among the
Exactly.
women female CEO? And so she's like, what it's like is I'm trying to run a company and now I have to spend 20% of my time answering questions about what it's like to be a female CEO. That's 20% of my time that I can't just run my business. And it's kind of a chicken and egg thing where, I want to highlight these women as amazing CEOs, but, and I don't want to emphasize their femaleness, but at the same time, until we identify other archetypes and elevate other images of what CEOs look like, and they don't all look like Mark Zuckerberg or a Wall Street guy in a suit, then once we get to that point when CEOs are so much more common, you won't have to talk about their femaleness anymore. And I hope, by the way, in a couple of years, no one ever says the word female when they're talking about female CEOs. They're just CEOs.
Yeah, I struggle with that too when I have them as podcast guests, and that's one of the questions that I'm like, should I ask? Should I not ask? But then I get a lot of emails from people who are like, oh, you should have female CEOs on there and ask them how they became CEOs and what it was like to be a female CEO. So I keep getting these questions from people who listen to the podcast. So I feel the pressure to ask, but then whenever I ask these female CEOs, they're just looking at me like, "What are you talking about?" I'm just a CEO.
I'm just a CEO. I will say that if you ask anyone about work-life balance stuff, you have to make sure to ask the men the work-life balance stuff as much as the women.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so you interviewed quite a few people for the book. Are there some particular stories that stand out to you from a leadership perspective, like some of your favorite stories?
Well, look, I don't want to pick any favorites. I love all my stories equally. And each of these stories had a different meaning to me. And in fact, there were so many additional stories that I could have included in there. I just couldn't, for one reason or other, including space. This book would have been 3,000 pages long. But I think that the different stories have different relevance depending on the characteristic that we're thinking about. When I think about with the COVID waves and headlines about volatility, I think about managing in crisis and the CEOs I interviewed who had a particular approach to managing in crisis and the importance of adaptability. And then in other situations, when it's about getting to the crux of a problem, getting to the root of the problem, I think about the CEOs who embrace contextual thinking and trying to think big picture to solve structural issues instead of just putting Band-Aids on things. So I could highlight one or two, but I don't want to pick and choose and say there is just one favorite one.
Yeah, well, why don't we actually, before we jump into the stories, let's talk about some of the common themes that emerge. Then maybe we can go through those common themes and you can share a story that you like from each one of those themes. So from interviewing all these female leaders, you mentioned earlier on that they were doing something to become extraordinary, to stand out, and that's something that we can all learn. So what were those things that they were doing? And maybe you can just list some of them out, and then we'll go through each one and kind of unpack it in a little bit more detail.
Sure. Well, I would say that one thing that really struck me for all of the women is this idea of that no one is born a leader. No one is born really good at things, period. And I expected to discover that some of these women are just extraordinarily good at one thing or another, extraordinarily good at decision making, extraordinarily good at adapting. And I thought they just came out like that. They've been like that their whole lives. And this is true for every characteristic in the book. No one is born a good leader. No one's born a great leader. No one's even born a leader. Any great characteristic that any of us have has to be practiced. And so I loved seeing, it was so reassuring that anyone can make improvement. Yeah. But I think this was true for every characteristic. And there's a lot of data about sports and leadership. And I don't know if you've seen this data, but especially with women that women who do athletics in college and high school are more likely to be leaders. And I think, when I dove into that, I was curious, is that because they're more competitive? Is that because they're trained to compete against other people or other teams? And that is not the case at all. In fact, the reason why sports is so important is something that we can all do even if we don't do sports. I'm not an athlete, but I can also learn from this, and that is an idea of self-competition. And the
Okay.
best progress comes from self-competition. So these women were all able to hone their talents to improve on maybe some of their natural instincts by measuring their progress. So self-competition is about identifying where you are when you're starting off, saying, this is something that I really care about improving on, and I'm going to just push myself and continually measure my progress against
Okay.
my own benchmarks. So I think for each of these characteristics that we can go through is this idea that they weren't born super adaptable. They weren't born knowing how to use vulnerability as a superpower. They figured out what a skill was that was going to be useful to them, that maybe they had an instinct towards, and then they figured out how to improve that skill set.
Yeah, I like that. And that is very reassuring because a lot of people, as I'm sure you've seen a lot of debates, are you born a leader? Are leaders made? Do you have to have some of these qualities or not? And it's interesting that you mentioned vulnerability because that's what my next book is about. That's going to come out mid next year. So we can
Awesome.
talk about that too. So what were these qualities and characteristics that you identified?
Well, we can talk about vulnerability. So I would say vulnerability is one of them, but
Okay.
understanding how to use vulnerability as a flip side of confidence. So that's one thing that we should talk about.
Okay.
The importance of adaptability, and learning and being willing to change your mind, learning from a big group of people and being able to change your mind. And then I would say is the third one that sticks out is contextual thinking. So should we
Okay.
start from the top?
Yeah, let's start with vulnerability. I suspect
So,
there's probably a lot we can talk about there.
yeah, I'm so curious what your research is on this. So I highlight Gwyneth Paltrow as using vulnerability as a superpower, and she is someone who seems like she's the ultimate in terms of beautiful, perfect, wealthy, successful, Oscar winning, comes from a phenomenal, successful family.
Yeah.
Like, what does this woman not have going for her? But her success really hinged on her ability to grow her company Goop by saying, I don't know everything, I don't have all the answers. And saying I struggled with things like postpartum. She was very open with her
Yeah.
struggles about postpartum, and that was a turning point in terms of people being drawn to her. Otherwise she would have been incredibly intimidating, but her vulnerability made her accessible, but also opened her to being a conduit for all of her readers, and the people who buy all the products on Goop to learn. So there's a lot of data about the power of vulnerability in leadership. And to me, vulnerability ties in really well with this idea of confidence. Like, we always think about leaders. I mean, I remember when I was starting off at Fortune magazine, I thought leaders were unilaterally confident. They always felt they knew they were doing the right thing. And of course, that is not the case. No one is
Yeah.
confident all the time. But what I found in the data is that the most successful leaders see confidence as on a dial. And this idea that you should turn down confidence on your dial when you're doing data gathering, when you're trying to figure out what the answer to a question is. And so if you have a problem, you need to figure out what the question is. You should turn down your confidence, and you should be as vulnerable and open to all solutions as possible. And so being open, saying, I don't know the answers, I have no idea what to do here,
Yeah.
enables you to draw solutions and opportunities and possibilities from every possible place. Then once you've gathered all that info that maybe you wouldn't have been able to gather if you had a hunch that you were a little bit, starting to build confidence on, then once you build your thesis and your plan, when it comes time to execute, that is when you should dial up the confidence dial and execute. But this idea that you shouldn't always push yourself to be confident all the time is such a game changer
Yeah.
in terms of opening people up to learning. So I love that. I love that. And that is something I actually use every day.
Did you find any differences between men and women? For example, are they more comfortable? Are they more vulnerable more often than men?
So the data shows that women are more comfortable being vulnerable.
Okay.
And that's a lot of this. And by the way, all the data in my book, almost every single piece of data in my book is about socially and culturally relevant things. I'm not saying that women are biologically comfortable being more
Yeah.
vulnerable, but they're socialized to be more comfortable being vulnerable.
Okay.
But of course, if men were vulnerable in business as well, there's great value to that. So that is just a social construct, and men would also benefit from the act of vulnerability, which, by the way, also makes you appealing to employees and more relatable, et cetera, to certain types of customers. So I think it's interesting there. There is some really interesting data about confidence and gender and age. And the data shows that men start off like straight out of college. Men start off more confident and women start off less confident straight out of the gate with no work experience or anything. As time goes on, the men's confidence goes down and women's confidence goes up, and the confidence sort of crosses around age 50.
Interesting.
And some data has it closer to 40, some data has it at 50. But what's interesting is around 50, you have a lot of experience.
Yeah.
So women's confidence rises in conjunction with their experience, and men might start off more confident even though they have no experience. And then as they get older and they realize how much less they know than they thought they did, their confidence goes down, and women's confidence crosses.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting. And there's actually a lot of data about how women are more likely to take risks around that age because their confidence has caught up and really is in line with their experience. So I think that stuff is really fascinating.
Yeah, no, definitely. Vulnerability, again, totally agree. I think there's a lot we can all learn from that, regardless, men, women, doesn't matter. All right, let's jump to adaptability, and then we'll reserve the last 15 minutes so we can go through each one of these again and talk about what we should do for these three things. So vulnerability we talked about. What about adaptability? What does that actually mean, and any stories that supports that? Actually, do you have any vulnerability stories now that I think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Gwyneth Paltrow was such a good one. I mean, you think of her as being the megawatt superstar,
Just
Pepper
sharing,
Potts.
being transparent.
Yeah, and so when she made this decision she launched Goop, which is a commerce and content platform. And when she made the decision to talk about her struggles with postpartum depression, it really surprised people. It wasn't postpartum depression at the time was not something that people talked about, particularly celebrities. And so that was a decision where she said, I'm going to say what I don't know about this. And interestingly, that's not only been key to her content success, but it's something that she uses as a management tool. I mean, she didn't go to business school. She didn't finish college. She's very open about that. And when she's in meetings, she, especially before she became CEO, because she was not CEO for a long time at the company, she started, for a while, she would sit in meetings with her phone under the desk and she would be Googling acronyms. And she'd be like Googling acronyms, trying to figure out what people were saying. If someone used jargon, she would just like Google it quietly under the desk. And she decided at one point, around the point when she was like, okay, I should be CEO of this company, she started just saying, can you explain this acronym to me? And what she found, or like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Why are you saying that this profitability issue or whatever it was? She just started being very, very upfront about things she wasn't entirely sure about. And what she found is that other people in the meeting were thrilled. And there were a lot of other people in the meeting who didn't know the answers or weren't totally sure what people were talking about.
Yeah.
Thrilled to have the clarity. And so once she saw that, she was like, me not being afraid to admit that I don't know is such a value add for the business. The whole company is going to do better if we're just totally upfront about what we don't know, and then we can learn from that. So to me, I think it was interesting that was an approach used in her content, but then also in her personal journey as a CEO.
Yeah, I like that, because oftentimes a lot of people don't know, but nobody wants to be the first one to ask. So
nobody wants to be the first one to ask, but once the founder of the company asks, then
it's okay. Everybody can ask.
The floodgates open. Yeah.
All right, let's talk a little bit about adaptability and any stories there.
So I honed in on adaptability in my my chapter on managing in crisis, and I looked specifically at how 3 leaders navigated like the first year of the pandemic. I mean, what a crisis! Unprecedented crisis, crazy times. And the 3 leaders I looked at were 2 CEOs of nonprofits. The CEO of Care USA, Michelle Nunn, the CEO of Feeding America, Claire Babineaux-Fontenot. And of course, these are 2 organizations where the need and the demand for their services went through the roof. Feeding America is the leading food bank and food pantry organization in the country. Care USA runs 69 different countries, service work on the ground, helping people with everything from clean water to job training, to so many different things, like really essential work. And then the third company I looked at was Clear. Clear is that biometrics company that gets you through airports really quickly. And of course, it would seem like these 3 organizations didn't have a lot in common. Feeding America is just in the US. CARE is an international organization, and then CLEAR is like has nothing to do with those. It's in getting people onto airplanes quickly. But in fact, these women did. I mean, they were all facing different types of challenges through the pandemic, but they all succeeded by being really adaptable and by planning ahead for worst case scenarios and figuring out how to look around corners in terms of listening to their constituents and what they needed. So one thing that was really notable in the nonprofits is they made a plan during the pandemic. They said, we know everyone's suffering. We know we need to get food to people at food banks around the country in the US for Feeding America. CARE International was like, we are going to send people soap and hand sanitizer so people in developing countries won't get COVID. They had these plans.
Okay.
It turns out that what they were doing was not the right thing. They needed to listen to the people on the ground and adapt. So for instance, like CARE USA, they managed 69 different countries of CARE International's service. And the women and they largely serve women, the women were saying, we can't eat soap. We can't eat hand sanitizer. Yeah. You need to help us make money so we can have food. And so what they realized, what they were doing had the best intentions, but was really not working. And they needed to pivot based on that. And then for Feeding America, the food banks were panicked and were like holding on to their resources. And what the CEO, Claire Babineau-Fontenot, realized is she needed to convince them that it was going to be okay. And that if she can convince the people on the ground that they were going to get the resources they needed, then the people on the ground would be more flexible. Yeah. And they'd share the extra things they didn't need. So it turns out that what was necessary for success in those crises was not at all what they anticipated going in, but their ability to listen to the people on the ground enabled them to learn things it's the vulnerability, learn things they would never have expected would be useful, and then to really, really quickly pivot. And interestingly, with CLEAR, it's amazing that CLEAR didn't go out of business during the pandemic.
I was just going to say.
Right. So airline travel dropped by 80%. How could a company that is at the time was entirely reliant on airline travel not go out of business? But adaptability. The CEO, Karen Seidman-Becker, was like, we already have started working on this technology that's going to be a health pass that can integrate with health data. Let's make this a top priority, invest all of our resources on that, while at the same time reassuring our travel customers that we're not going to be a convenience tool, we're going to be a health tool. Yeah. We are going to help you get through the airport without touching anything. So she took all of her resources and she said, we actually, if we adapt how we do these things, if we adapt what our priorities are, we can take our skill set right now and actually be stronger after the pandemic. So now CLEAR is used not just for travel, but they also have this health pass technology that's used by conferences and employers. And so it actually was a turning point for CLEAR to actually build its next leg of growth. So adapting in crisis is essential and oftentimes can reveal massive upside opportunity.
Yeah, very cool. I didn't know that about CLEAR actually. I'm a member of CLEAR for the airport. I didn't know about all the other stuff.
You had to use it for a conference. Every conference I've gone to, they make you fill out a CLEAR health pass. You can link your vaccine cards, and it's a great way, for employees. If you have a big building, you get people in and out of the building. Like when the NFL were doing their bubbles in that first year of the pandemic, they could only do it because of CLEAR. But if you think about how quickly that company pivoted, that is a unique approach in terms of quick adaptability.
All right, I know we only have 1 or 2 minutes before we get to the action items, so let's quickly touch on contextual thinking, and then we'll go over what should we actually be doing for all these three things. So what is contextual thinking?
Contextual thinking is this idea of looking for the forest and not just focusing on the trees. And there's some great data about how women, when you're in a crisis situation, women facing a problem, women are more likely when you're solving a problem to ask about related things, to say, well, what about that thing that we talked about yesterday? What about this thing? Whereas men are like, let's just fix the problem right now, not waste time talking about tangential things. In fact, asking questions about tangential things can create a bigger picture solution. And the CEO that I wanted to highlight here is the CEO of a company called City Block Health. She's a woman named
Okay.
Toyin Ajayi. And this is a company that is trying to fix the way healthcare works in the US, especially for the lowest income people and for the population that oftentimes is getting treated in an emergency room and not getting proper long-term care. Emergency room treatment is Band-Aid treatment. Emergency room treatment is not, that's the tree, fixing the tree, not healing the forest. And so what she's trying to do is pair doctors with people who are social workers to help their patients improve their overall quality of life and therefore reduce the number of times that they're rushing into the emergency room and getting incredibly expensive sort of Band-Aid treatment, but not actually helping them make sure that they're getting better housing or better access to food or whatever it is they need. And they actually get paid not on the volume of treatment, but on the quality of the outcome over the long term.
I'm sure everybody wishes it was everywhere we went, we were treated and the employees were rewarded based on quality, not based on other things. I think all customer experiences would be better if that was the case across the board. All right, so let's talk a little bit about in the last 15 minutes what we can do for all three of these things. So starting off with vulnerability, and my understanding that the advice is the same for men and for women, no difference there. So when it comes to vulnerability, how do you think that we should bring this into our organizations, practice this in a way that makes sense?
So I'm going to actually answer that question and make it an action item, but with a story about a CEO in the book.
Okay.
There's a company called Workboard that basically systematizes this. I'm sure you talk a lot in your podcast about a growth mindset.
Yes.
But I think there's this idea that if you're going to have a growth mindset, you need to be vulnerable. You can't improve if you don't acknowledge that you have faults and without humility. So I think the best way to push yourself to improve is by acknowledging where your weaknesses are. So Deidre Packnad at Workboard, what she has done is created the system that invites feedback and improvement or solutions for problem solving from anywhere across an organization. So it shows your progress, your objectives and key results, your OKRs. But it also says if someone in a group at an organization in a division has a problem, it invites other people from other divisions to weigh in.
Okay.
And there's this idea of opening up the conversation. It's embarrassing to admit that you don't know the answer or that you're still searching for an answer or you're stuck on a problem. But I think that the reality is that, if you can admit that and admit that you're still looking for help, opening up the solutions to a broader group of people can sometimes be incredibly valuable and bring in new, different, even surprising perspectives that a narrow group might not have. Again, the value of diverse ideas.
Yep.
So I think this is something, depending on the problem, depending on the group, the more people can open up the solutions for conversation. There was one tool that a couple of the CEOs in the book I talked to mentioned. There's a CEO named Shanlin Ma. She's the CEO of a wedding planning company called Zola.
Okay.
And she's an introvert. She's a professed introvert. And she said she noticed that in meetings, the loudest people, the most extroverted, were the ones who would dominate the meeting and often dominate decision making because they would say their beliefs were the loudest, right? What she instituted was a policy where people would discuss a problem or a situation. Then they would write down or put their vote on a topic quietly. And then they would, before they'd actually said, they might discuss the situation, but they would not voice their opinions until everyone had already made their vote.
Okay.
So then that would create an opportunity to get people to share their opinion that might disagree with the loudest person in the room. So this can be done when you're making an investment, but just let people share their perspective in a private way. So they're not going to be like, well, why even bother disagreeing with this guy? He's just going to railroad me anyways. He's going to just blow past me. So I'm not going to keep up with his loud argument making. So I'm just not going to share my opinion. This way you get in people's votes. And I think it's a really useful way to get some of the quieter people in the room whose perspectives are just as valid to share their perspectives before they're intimidated by the louder person in the room.
Okay. And then for all of us who are showing up to organizations, whether in person or virtually, who want to start bringing vulnerability into our organizations or to start practicing vulnerability, is there anything that we can do? Like, do we just show up to work and just experiment with asking for help or admitting to making a mistake? Or what do you recommend that people do right after listening to you?
I think there's a lot of talk about psychological safety.
Yeah.
Right. This idea, like Gwyneth Paltrow, by saying, I don't know the answer, I don't know what this means, was establishing a level of psychological safety for the room, saying, if anyone else doesn't know, that's okay too, by just leading with her example. So I think it's really important for leaders to set the example and to create a sense of psychological safety. And some of that is saying, look, there are things that I don't know and I want to learn. And others is saying, I want you guys to know that it's okay to ask questions. No one's going to be fired for asking a dumb question. And part of that is leading by example, and part of that is like creating policies around it. And such as structures, by if you have a tough problem you can't solve, creating systems so you can share that with a broader group without being embarrassed or penalized that you didn't figure out how to solve it on your own.
Let's go to adaptability. How do we start to practice that? And again, thinking of individuals inside of organizations who want to be able to embrace that kind of mindset, that way of thinking. Where do we begin? How do we start to implement that?
I think it comes down to this idea of continuing to collect information.
Okay.
And sometimes people make a plan and they just say like, okay, well, we've made this plan. We have to stick with it. Like we can't change course. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too complicated. There's no way we could change course at this point in the game. You can always change course.
Yeah.
You can always figure out maybe it's going to cost more now short term, but it'll be better long term. But being willing to continue to gather data, and specifically to gather data from the people closest to the problem on the ground. And that is something that came up time and time again in my reporting on responding to things in crisis, because you have to listen to your customers. You have to, if you're feeding America, you have to listen to the food banks. And you have to specifically understand that people's needs are not what you're going to assume assume they are. And especially in crisis situations, you have no idea what is actually going on. In unprecedented situations like the pandemic, you actually have to get data. A lot of these organizations found that like frequent surveys of customers or frequent surveys of for Care USA, that these lending groups gave them access into like a really good sense of what was happening. And now they're great tools to pull people really frequently and actually get a sense of things almost in real time, because things change so quickly. So I just think data.
Yeah, and it seems like the data can come in a couple different forms, right? Survey data or kind of anecdotal, talking to leaders, talking to customers, talking to employees. I mean, even on this podcast, right? I've interviewed 600 people over the years, and I don't have like data in terms of a particular number, but data in terms of a lot of the things that I've learned from people. So it seems like the way to have adaptability is you got to get out of your own little bubble, talk to people in different departments, on different teams, and spend some time out of your little area.
And also the humility to acknowledge that maybe your original plan is not the one that's going to last for the long term.
Yep. The last one that we have is contextual thinking. So how do we embrace and practice that?
I think of contextual thinking is trying to get to the root of a problem and solve it, and trying to think about being what this professor called Bonita Banducci calls being a fire preventer instead of a firefighter, right? A firefighter sweeps in there, puts out the fire, gets credit for saving the day. But it's much better if the fire never happens.
Yeah.
It might not be as glamorous. You might not get as much credit for it, but you're going to be a lot more successful if you can orient your company, orient your group, your division towards trying to prevent fires from happening. Think about what the structural issues are where things could go wrong. What is the big picture challenge that you face that, you might be able to keep on putting a Band-Aid on the problem, but you're better off looking broadly, asking those tangential questions that might seem unrelated, might be annoying to the people who are just pushing and rushing and driving towards a quick solution. But ultimately, you're better off getting the biggest picture perspective on what someone's challenge is, so you can solve the problem. I mean, it's interesting. In one of the companies I interviewed, the CEO of Spring Health, April Coe, and they are trying to help with mental health mental health issues. And so they, traditionally, treating someone for depression is a really long process and is a lot of trial and error, and there's not a lot of data about what works. But they start off with this survey, and it's a pretty basic survey. There's nothing that high tech about a survey, but what they do with the survey is they layered over the data from thousands and thousands of other people about what works, whether it's lifestyle changes, what specific antidepressants, what specific sleep, patterns, etc. And with all that information, they can not just give someone an antidepressant, but give a much more big picture solution for all of the lifestyle things that are going to help them. And so I think increasingly the world is moving in a direction where you have to look big picture, right? You have to look at the whole thing. And I think that whether it's treating the whole patient or looking at what problems might emerge in a company, if you're not looking at the health of the company, or if you're really thinking about what your consumers want, your customers want, it can just be much more practical for the long run, but it might be harder in the short run. It might take longer. It might feel like a waste of time if you're going down these rabbit holes in a meeting. And so why is this person asking these random questions and going down rabbit holes? But ultimately, there can be a lot of value in pulling those strings and going down those tangents.
It reminds me a lot of chess. I play a lot of chess. I have a chess coach that I work with, and he's always reminding me, look at all 64 squares. Don't just look at like where the action is happening on the board. Because oftentimes a bishop or a queen can come flying from the other side of the board, and all of a sudden you lose a piece or you lose the game.
Exactly.
So pay attention to all 64 squares is kind of the way that I internalize that. So I
it
love
might take you longer to make a move, but the move will be a smarter one.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more. Well, Julia, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your advice. Why don't you let people know where can they go to learn more about you? Where can they grab the book? Anything else that you want to mention for people to check out?
Well, thank you so much for having me. You can learn more about me and the book on juliaboorstin.com, JuliaBoorstin.com. And you could buy When Women Lead. It's on Amazon. It's at your local bookseller. It's at barnesandnoble.com. Just search for When Women Lead and it'll pop up. Really fun stories with actionable takeaways. And I think it'll be a fun read and valuable for men, even more so maybe than it is for women.
I love it. Well, Julia, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. And thanks everyone for tuning in. My guest again, Julia Boorstin. Please make sure to check out her book. It is called When Women Lead, What We Achieve, Why We Succeed, and What We Can Learn. It is coming out October 11th of this year, and it is already available for pre-order wherever you can grab a book. And I will see all of you next week. Thanks again for tuning into today's episode. Please remember to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred channel is. I cannot express how important those reviews and ratings are to the success of this show, and they keep allowing me to bring back amazing guests. Lastly, don't forget to check out the brand new PDF that I just put out, which looks at the evolution of the employee. In other words, how employees are evolving and changing and what you as an organization should do to adapt. You'll get a complete breakdown of what that evolution looks like, as well as action items that you can and should be taking. That PDF is available at thefutureemployee.com. And if you want to reach out to me for whatever reason, whether it's inviting me to speak, sponsoring the show, or just giving me some feedback, you can always do so. My email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Again, that's jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.